Hello, friends. Welcome back for more on Modern Art 2, Impressionism Part B. Just to real quick review some of the characteristics of Impressionist art, the focus on the themes of visual perception. How do we see what we see and how do we interpret it? Nature, more as a backdrop rather than as a force against which human action is defined. Ordinary life by ordinary people, and especially the pleasures ordinary people take in their ordinary lives. The techniques that we'll see in the rest of the art we look at is the analytical treatment of light, the analysis of how our eyes perceive light, as well as how our brain interprets it. The use of harmonious color schemes that blend together to create an attractive, pleasing sense of harmony. The use of visible brushwork that is possible because the artists practiced it a lot to make it look easier than it is. But it draws attention to the fact that we're looking at a painting. There's no attempt to reproduce the effects of photography, which had, by the way, come into use by this point. And the use of informal framing as well, creating the illusion of reality by rendering the scene, by showing the scene as if it hasn't been carefully framed, but we've just happened to walk into the scene. We especially see that technique, the unexpected and apparently informal framing, in the work of this artist, Edgar Degas, another very well-loved Impressionist artist, especially well-loved because his favorite subject were beautiful dancers, particularly female dancers, women. One reason why he was drawn to the subject was because it gave him the excuse to spend a lot of time in the company of beautiful young women, but also because it gave him the opportunity to explore the effect of artificial light, of indoor light, in interesting and creative ways. This image is it's a painting that looks a lot like a pastel, that is a colored chalk drawing. In some of Degas' images, it's kind of hard to tell which is which because he uses this very pastel-like tone with his paint. What's interesting about this image is also, again, how strange the composition is, how he clusters these four dancers off to the left, and on the right we see the backdrop of a stage set that almost seems like it's an homage, an imitation of one of Monet's paintings. He did a number of paintings of grain stacks. Again, just sort of exploring the different ways in which lighting effects play off of them. Notice the angle of the girl's arms and the way in which the artificial light, the gaslight, reflects off of them. Creates these subtle and interesting effects that are not particularly naturalistic. There's a lot of green in this on their skin, which is part of the effect of, creates the effect in our minds of the indoor light. Here's another image of dancers where Degas is doing interesting things with the composition as well. The lower right-hand corner of the image is almost all empty space, which helps, again, define our relationship to the subjects, to the girls, the ballerinas practicing in this practice hall. Degas didn't only focus on dancers, but sometimes singers and other show people. This is an image from a cabaret, a nightclub scene, where again we get this kind of unexpected angling, like we've just walked into the scene from the side. The footlights, the lights at the foot of the stage, again create this artificial effect of lighting up the face from below that's unnatural, but gives us a really strong sense of atmosphere. Degas did sometimes paint outdoor scenes as well, especially at racetracks. He seems to have been as drawn to racehorses as he was to ballerinas, their angular limbs and the way in which their surfaces, in this case their coats, catch the light, was something he was really drawn to. And again, we see, as with many of the other Impressionist artists, he's captured the atmosphere so effectively that you have to look pretty closely to see how little detail there is in so much of the scene and how he leaves our brains to fill in the gaps. Also, note, by the way, the way in which the shadows of the horses, you understand right away that they're shadows. You consciously, you're probably think of shadows as being gray or black, but in fact, they're simply a darker shade of whatever the shadow was falling on. He's painted them in green against this yellowish background, which is, again, somewhat unnaturalistic, and yet our brain knows how to interpret them as exactly what they are. This is one of the most well-known images by one of the least well-known of the Impressionist artists, Gustave Caillebotte. As you can see, he died fairly young. He was not all that prolific as an artist, all that productive, partly because he was so busy spending his money. Unlike most of the rest of the Impressionists, he came from money. He was independently wealthy, and apparently he was really generous. He was really supportive of many of the other artists who, at the beginning of their careers, were pretty impoverished because they were creating such avant-garde art. This, as I said, is his most famous painting, Rainy Day. It's just again, an ordinary street scene in Paris. Um, what's notable about it is, first of all, how may take you a while to notice. You may not even have noticed at all how odd, how bizarre the composition, the arrangement of it is. The way the image is just divided up into four quadrants with this green lamppost in the middle, dividing it vertically, and the horizon line dividing it horizontally. And notice each quarter of it is almost a completely disjoined set of images. Right? Each one focuses on a completely different aspect of the scene in front of us. So that kind of disjointedness is a feature that is, in fact, often focused on in other forms of modern art and literature as an aspect of modern life, where things are there's a kind of fragmentation of the world and of society. So this is a particularly beautiful image that suggests that idea. Again, one thing that's notable about this is it seems almost photographic. He's captured the the atmosphere of light and the reflections of light off of wet surfaces so perfectly, and yet if you look at, for example, the upper left-hand corner where that big apartment block fades into the distance, it's really loosely brushed in. There's very little detail in there. So he knows just how much detail to give you to make you think you're seeing more than you are. Another image by Caillebotte that uses this sort of unexpected angle of vision with this great big diagonal splitting the whole image in half, and the upper right dominated by this big hulking iron structure. Shows compositionally it's really adventurous. It's also like some of the other Impressionist art we looked at, like notably Monet's Gare Saint-Lazare. It's a celebration of the modern city. That this is the Pont de l'Europe, the European bridge. It was one of the bridges, brand new bridges built in Paris in the 19th century using the most up-to-date techniques. The exposed steel beams are a feature of modern architecture, the Eiffel Tower being the most famous example of that style, where architects, rather than disguising the structure, what was holding the building up with a lot of decoration and marble sheathing and so on, actually lets the structure itself be the design. So this is not simply what's recognizably a scene from a modern day city, but one that emphasizes its modernity. And of course, it's a good picture because it has a dog in it. Not all of the artists in the Impressionist circle were French, and not all of them were women. I mean, were men rather. Mary Cassatt, an American from Philadelphia, was one of the leading members of the group. There weren't that many women in the group, but there were some, and she was one of the stars. She came from a wealthy family, got permission, was supported by her family to go to Paris to study art, and she fell in among the Impressionists and became one of the best of them. She tends to focus especially on scenes of domestic life. Partly that may reflect just what she was expected to do as a woman, to focus on family life. But it does, she shows family relationships in such a charming, intimate way that clearly it was also an interest to her. This one shows the flattening style. By looking down on these figures from above, um, she's created the perspective for us that is very flattened, as in Japanese art, um, but creates the illusion of more depth through her subtle manipulation of light. Another one, how the framing of the image by cropping it so close to the girl in the front, but just giving us a sort of partial view of the whole room behind us. She creates this pretty vivid sense of space in this overstuff, over upholstered Paris apartment. I love how the girl and the dog, that is a little dog, a kind of terrier of some kind, on the chair on the left, look equally bored, like it's an overwarm Sunday afternoon at grandma's house or something. So the way her whole body language, in a very unposed looking, natural way, brings us into the scene. But again, if you look at the brush work, like on the upholstery, on the chair, the pattern, this sort of Chinese silk on the chair, the way in which the girl's dress is just a scumble, just a very loose web of brushwork. Um, it draws our attention to the brushwork at the same time that it allows us to sort of blend it together in our mind to see a whole scene. Another more outdoorsy scene by Mary Cassatt, mostly known for her indoor scenes, but again, a family circle. I love how the awkwardness with that baby is half sliding off her mother's lap. And yet the baby is still looking, I think lovingly at the father rowing the boat. Again, brings us right into this family circle. And it's also, again, very flattened. The whole image is brought right up against the surface for us. Another one of the women in the circle, Beth Morisot, not as well known today, although she's, again, partly probably because after her death, like many women artists, she was neglected by the art establishment for a long time, but she's definitely coming up for, has come up for more notice in recent decades. Like Mary Cassatt, most of her paintings are of, they focus more on women and circles of women. Like here, the artist mother and her daughter and her sister. And this charming image of a mother with her child. Again, notice how aware you are of the brushwork as of the paint as paint, but also aware of just the naturalness, the ordinariness of the scene. James McNeill Whistler is another American who's sort of associated with the Impressionists, but kind of hard to fit him in with the rest of them because unlike them, he's like the rest of the Impressionists, and he was sometimes in his life associated with them, linked with them, because he was definitely interested in exploring our perceptions of light and shadow. But unlike the Impressionists, he was not interested in creating the impression of spontaneity. His brushwork is often visible, but it's never as loose as you see it in the other Impressionists. And his compositions also are usually very, very rigid and composed and almost geometric. He really is sort of moving towards abstraction, as we'll see in the next generation of, especially of American artists. So his most famous painting, Whistler's Mother, which is often used as almost an illustration of quintessential, of typical American puritanical motherhood or something. There's really not much of a sense of personality or feeling in this. He's really just interested in exploring the variations of gray. That's why he called the painting, its actual title is Arrangement in Gray and Black #1. So it's more an exploration of shape and color and form. than of the personality of the sitter. This is a nice contrast to Edward O. Tanner's painting of his mother, which has a kind of similar composition, but that one is really much more interested in conveying a mood. This is more interested in making us aware of all these variations of gray, of how much color there is to be found in what we think of as gray. As in this painting, he's focusing our attention on how many variations there are in what we perceive as white. This one is also, like we've seen in some of the others, it's a very flattened image. Notice how by looking at we're seeing the floor and that bare rug on the floor, almost as if it's we're looking at it from above at the same time that we're looking at the background drape from in front. This is, by the way, so notice he again called this one Symphony in White. He's using a musical term that suggests an abstraction to it. It's then been nicknamed the White Girl, drawing our attention more to the subject. But his real subject was the shades, our perception of the shades, and how many different ways we can see, or how many different shades there are that we perceive as white. This, the woman in the painting, by the way, I don't recall her name, but as with Manet's portraits of a woman looking right out at us in a kind of confrontational way, this was Whistler's mistress. So he was being a little bit willing to court scandal by showing the woman he was sleeping with as a subject. Here's one more of his paintings that this one fits a little bit more with the style of the other Impressionists in that it's kind of soft focus. It definitely conveys the atmosphere of the scene. He again uses a musical term. Nocturne is a term for a piece of music meant to be played at night in order to draw our attention to the formal elements of the scene rather than the subject of it. But again, this is a painting done in London, the old Battersea Bridge, which is another steel-framed building. So he is focusing his attention on an aspect of the modern city, modern architecture. And one last artist to look at who is kind of I'm lumping him in with Impressionists because he sometimes is associated with them, but doesn't quite fit in as comfortably. Auguste Rodin, mostly known as a sculptor, almost entirely known as a sculptor. I don't know of any paintings or drawings that he's known for. And this is far and away his most famous sculpture, at least among American viewers, The Thinker. There are multiple versions of it because it is a bronze cast. So it would have been created out of wax first and then put into a plaster mold, the wax melted out, and bronze poured in to create the image, so you can make multiple versions of the same sculpture from the same set of molds. The ones that are left outside, as you can see, develop a patina, this sort of bluish green tint to them that also has elements of brown to it. So this is the one that's in Paris. This one in a more sheltered setting in San Francisco. You can see more of the original tone of the bronze, more brownish gold. What's notable about this image is there is a kind of soft focus quality often to the way Rodin sculpts the human figure, and almost all of his statues are of human figures. But there's also a kind of coiled, tensed energy, muscular energy to them, which is something that he owes directly to Michelangelo from back in the 16th century. So that's one reason why he doesn't fit quite comfortably into the style and concerns of the Impressionist painters, because clearly his figures are meant to be perceived as heroic and muscular and larger than life. What's interesting also, by the way, about the Thinker, there's another version of it, is almost every parody imitation version, and I'm sure you've seen multiple imitations of it, almost all of them get it wrong. And from this view, you can see what they mostly get wrong. The figure is placing his right elbow on his left knee. Almost anytime you see somebody pose as if they're posing as the Thinker, they put their right elbow on the right knee. But by posing the figure with his elbow on his left knee, the opposite knee, the artist has actually created even more tension in the body. So that's how you get this sense of, as I say, that kind of coiled up energy, which in this case, he's had said in writing that um, this was meant to kind of embody in the physical form the hard work of thought, that it's a kind of metaphor of intense thought through the physicality of this muscular figure. Um, this grouping of figures is another kind of quietly heroic image. It is an illustration or a reproduction of a scene from French history from back in the late Middle Ages, um, when the city of Calais, along the northwest coast of of France, was under siege by the English under King Henry V, who was laying claim to a big chunk of France. And when the city was besieged, and basically there was no hope for it to escape the attack by the English forces, the English commander said he would spare the lives of the people of the city if the city leaders basically gave themselves up as prisoners of war. And so they did so in this sort of self-sacrifice rather than just hold out for, hoping to achieve some sort of unrealistic military victory. They humbled themselves. They basically, Rodin depicts them almost in beggar-like clothes. And so the humility, the sadness, the somberness of the scene is communicated through their postures, through their physical gestures, and so on. But there's still a kind of muscularity and tension to the figures that's very characteristic of Michelangelo. But you can see in the close-up that there is a kind of softness to his depiction of features. And we especially see that this is probably his most impressionist work that I know of. This marble sculpture, The Kiss. If you look at the features of the figure, the man and the woman who are kissing, you can possibly make out that they're carved in an almost fuzzy way, that there is a kind of softness to them that keeps it from being pornographic, you could say, although it was considered rather shockingly openly erotic in its time. But again, the sense of physical weightiness, and especially the muscularity of the male figure, again, suggests the work of Michelangelo. So that's it for our look at Impressionist art. There are plenty of other really good Impressionist artists to look at, but we don't have forever. So quick review some of the characteristics of the art we saw. A focus on visual perception as a subject, making us aware of how we see what we see. Nature, more as a backdrop than as a subject in its own right. Ordinary life, and especially the pleasures of ordinary life. And the techniques they used, treating light and shadow and color in an analytical way, using color in a very harmonious, pleasing way to the eye. Use of visible brushwork, so we're always aware that we're seeing paintings rather than photographs. And use of informal framing, or as I said, deceptively informal framing, to enhance the sense of spontaneity as if we're just walking into the scene. So that's it for Impressionist art. Thanks again for watching.